The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, is now streaming in its entirety on Prime Video. 8 episodes in this first season. I've been looking forward to this series because I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings. I love the entire franchise, and so when you tell me that there is something that is coming back that is going to bring you back to Middle-earth, I'm thinking, well, yeah, I'm in. This show takes place thousands of years, however, before the events of things that we know, and essentially is telling the story of how everything came to be. So you're seeing the origin stories and the way things were formed in Middle-earth, but also the tensions that were rising and the presence of an evil that was starting to rise as well, the rise of Sauron and how his followers started to come into being, and of course the good of elves and humans and everyone in the world trying to basically figure out what to do to stop this, which are being led by a few characters such as Galadriel and Elrond. And this show takes place across these 8 episodes with a lot of environments and a lot of locations that are familiar to Tolkien fans and fans of the franchise. And it's a show that has gotten a very strange response. Let's just put it that way. To say that this is a gamble for Amazon is nothing short of an understatement. It's because this has a lot of money pooled into it. To give you an idea, each episode of Rings of Power cost individually $30 million, which is insane because clearly they wanted to back this thing up as much as they could, but it's also a risk because what if after everything that you do, the show doesn't work? Now what happens in that scenario? You're out $1 billion, you made a huge mistake, and you probably put your entire streaming service future in jeopardy. But credit to where it's due, it's not a failure. They're making another season right now. It's clearly underway. They're making this thing try to work as best as possible. And the response that I was talking about is more to do with the social media backlash. Because there has been a lot of controversy. A lot of people seem to be really angry about this show. But I have to tell you, after seeing all 8 episodes, there's nothing about it to be angry over, at least not to the degree that some people are being angry over it. I mean, the show has its issues for sure, but there's a lot to praise in it at the same time. There's a lot you can do with the Lord of the Rings IP. Unfortunately, the things that people have been wanting to do for a while, that is, adapt things like the Silmarillion, are a little bit hard because the Tolkien estate is not exactly making those rights easy to give up. And so, in that sense, you have to try and figure out what you can do in the leeway that you have. And I would say, for the most part, the Rings of Power manages to tell a very interesting story. That builds for sure as it develops, but it does take a while to get going and definitely find its footing, and that's fine. This is the first season, it's setting up a vast thing, it's also reintroducing audiences to Middle-earth, so I totally understand why it would take a second to fully get into the zone. And so there are points where you'll find the pace to be very, I don't even want to say at a lull because it's a lot slower than that at times. They really take their time in telling these stories, which I think is also fine. I think some things are best told when you have them spaced out, but this one definitely does have moments where it drags a little bit. But for the most part, I do appreciate the fact that the show doesn't try to rush itself at any point. It tells a very categorically, strategically ordered story, and with all of the characters that it's introducing, who you're getting to know more and more about as the episodes progress, I think you end up with something that is pretty impressive nonetheless, even if albeit a bit flawed. But for $30 million an episode, you're also expecting some visual class, and let me tell you, the Rings of Power did not come to disappoint or, to just generally play. This is some of the most visually dazzling work I've seen on television in probably my entire life. There are sequences in here that are, in terms of just thinking about the small screen, you wouldn't imagine that these kinds of sequences would have made it to the small screen at any point. And yet there is special effects work in them that rivals 99% of blockbusters right now. There's a few sequences in particular that are among the most visually dazzling of the year. In particular, episode 6, Udun, there's this battle sequence that takes place, and then eventually it leads to an eruption of a mountain, which obviously is Mount Doom. but it's such a beautifully done sequence, and I have to give my praise to the VFX artists involved and everybody in the technical regards to this show. They've done a brilliant, just masterful job of bringing those things to the screen. As for the characters, you get to know a lot of them along the way. There are some that you already know of from stories, and so there's not much to do over there in terms of reintroducing you to them. But it was great seeing Galadriel again. Morfydd Clark, who you may know from Saint Maud, was fantastic. I think she plays a version of Galadriel that obviously is not the Galadriel that you know, because she's not there yet. Obviously, this show is trying to take you through her journey as to what brought her to that point. But before you're going to get to that point, you also have to go through somewhat of a darkness. And the show understands this and it emphasizes this because it definitely goes through this entire arc for her where she witnesses things and does things. And so all of those things seem to be building up to the conclusion that this is going to be too much to take after a certain point, or something's going to happen that alters something. As for other characters, you get a lot with Elrond as he meets Prince Durin, who is at Khazad-dûm. Seeing that was awesome, and seeing Durin was great. And the camaraderie that the two of them have, these old friends who haven't seen each other for a long time, and the animosity between them as elves and dwarves, all of those politics are explored really well. And it's one of the strong points of the season, I would say. Like the storyline that comes between the two of them. And then, of course, Elrond trying to find some kind of cure to help the elves and to help Gilgalad is also really interesting, especially because it's dying. And so what do you do with that scenario? And it turns out that Khazad-dûm has a bunch of mithril just ready to be mined. There's also a subplot involving the Harfoots, which is going on. The Harfoots are this other indigenous breed that are in Middle Earth, and they're constantly migrating. And then one of the Harfoots, Nori, she finds a stranger who falls from the stars. Now, they built up the reveal to this guy for so long, and I thought the storyline with him was interesting, although it did seem like you knew what was gonna happen. And especially in terms of the reveal, because eventually as the episodes progress, you start to see him, start to figure out what the hell is going on in this world. And he has these powers that are very strange but destructive, but it's clear that he doesn't intend any harm. It just seems to be a scenario where collateral damage could be a thing. And so characters are constantly wary of him because they're like, what if he does something that could potentially result in loss of life? But eventually, you kind of figured he's got to be someone we know. He's got to be this one really famous guy that we know. Something with his name being the Grey. I don't know. The show doesn't explicitly say it's Gandalf, but it's Gandalf. Like, they make that very, very apparent, and I think the show does a fairly solid job of this, and the relationship that he builds up with the other Harfoots eventually, who are also very wary of him at first. And then there's one final subplot, which is in many ways one of the main subplots, which takes place along with a village that is being run by Nazneen Bunyadi's Bronwyn, and she's trying to make sure that this great evil that's coming that can be taken on in some way, which is a pack of orcs coming to get them, could be potentially stopped in some way. And so there's an entire plot line over there about this sword hilt that her son finds, and that apparently is a key of sorts, which leads to the creation of Mount Doom. It's interesting. All of this is incredibly fascinating, although some of it could be told in some more streamlined ways for sure. All the stuff that happens when you get to Numenora as well is interesting. There's a lot of politics involved over there because Adriel and this other person who she's found in the ocean, Halbrand, they seem to have an inkling that something's coming, and so something has to be done in order to stop it from happening. I feel like I'm going a lot into plot synopsis and stuff right now, but this is a big show. Has this not been made clear so far? Like, there's so much happening in this thing. Naturally, it was going to go on for more than one season, but it's also so much in terms of, the sort of like wings they're trying to spread in terms of, it's crazy. And I have to give props to people who were involved in it for trying to keep this thing as cohesive and as interesting as possible, because you're so involved, and so much is, being laid out in all of that. And I'm very curious to see where it goes, even though you do know where it goes. You do know how Lord of the Rings ends, and you know what happens eventually to Sauron. But at the same time, you also want to kind of like be like, well, let's see the story. What do you got for us? And so I'm curious to see where things go from this point onwards and the story that it's going to tell. Although I do think that people were a little too mad on this. I don't think it's as bad as it's being made out to be in some cases. I don't think it's as insulting as some people think it is. I feel like there is this hyperbolic reaction that is going on with this show that I'm not sure if I completely agree with. At one point, I have to say, like, if you're not enjoying it because you're not enjoying it, that's one thing. But it also seems like there's another side of it, which is like, I don't want to enjoy it because they're doing things which are not the thing that I wanted, because it was like this and something and it's like this and something. Look, you're not writing the show, all right? They're writing the show. And on the basis of that, you can judge what's going on. But otherwise, it doesn't feel right to prejudge. Like, review bombing it beforehand is not going to do anything. It's just going to make people look like absolute fools. And so all I ask is just give it a chance. Just take a second, look at the show. If it's not working for you, that's fine. If it works for you, great. But that's something that each viewer needs to be left to those devices. And that's my only take on that. There's a lot more that I like when it comes to the Rings of Power, like Bear McCreary's score. Once again, I mean, this man has not missed, and once again continues to not do that, because he's done a phenomenal job. I love the fact that they brought Howard Shore back to do the theme, and so that was great to hear again. I loved all the stuff that you did with, like, sequences and all that, and like I already mentioned, the visuals are amazing. It is a gorgeous looking show. Where it could use some improvement is a little bit more focus when it comes to its storytelling. There's definitely too many cogs in the machine, too many cooks in the kitchen at times. And I think as the series progresses, that's going to be a lot more focused up. But as it stands, it's a show that I really enjoyed. However, I think it does have some issues along the way. And yes, there are definitely signs where it could be improved a lot more. But I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in season 2 and 3, and going forward and seeing what else that Middle Earth has to offer. I'm gonna give The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, season 1 a B+. Again, just to reiterate, I totally get whatever opinions you guys go with. I feel like it's one thing to, try and be like, hey, give it a chance. But at the end of the day, if you don't like it, you don't like it. All I'm saying is don't prejudge it, just because they're doing something differently. Or try to watch it with an open mind, at least. Don't go for the defense on like, oh, because there's a character over here who's, I don't know, not white. Don't get mad. That doesn't really help anything. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Look forward to more reviews very soon. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the movies.